This is Easter Island, home of the world-famous head statues, or Moai. Every Moai statue is essentially a gravestone, but with a twist. They've stood watch for centuries, towering stone giants, gazing silently over the Pacific. Their backs to the sea, as if guarding the island from something within. The Moai of Easter Island have long been a puzzle, their origin and purpose steeped in mystery. But now, new scientific discoveries have finally begun to crack the code. What they reveal isn't just fascinating, it's deeply unsettling. These ancient statues were never just symbols, they were warnings. The discovery that shook archaeology. For over a century, the Moai statues of Easter Island have been cast as mute witnesses to a cultural collapse. Impressive relics of a lost civilization, but little more than oversized stone heads planted in the earth. This is Easter Island, home of the world-famous head statues, or Moai. That perception began to unravel in the early 2010s when archaeologists revealed something astonishing. Most of the Moai actually have full bodies buried beneath the surface, some extending more than 30 feet into the ground. While that revelation was enough to stir public imagination, it was only the beginning. In the last 5 years, a new wave of excavations has exposed a far darker, far stranger layer of history beneath the surface. One that has left even seasoned archaeologists shaken. In 2023, a multinational team of scientists and researchers returned to Rapa Nui, Easter Island with more advanced tools and a controversial new theory that the Moai were more than monuments. They were covers. Focusing their efforts on the eastern slopes of the Ranaranaku quarry, the team uncovered an array of underground chambers carved into the volcanic rock directly beneath some of the largest statues. These weren't natural formations. They bore signs of deliberate construction tunnel supports made of basalt arranged stone steps descending into darkness and crudely reinforced walls. Some chambers appeared to be ceremonial in layout, with obsidian figurines arranged in circles, charred remnants of wooden structures, and deep, narrow pits that led farther underground. The most shocking aspect was the lack of any written record or oral tradition describing these structures. It was as if this entire layer of the island's past had been intentionally forgotten or deliberately buried. The soil samples collected from these chamber sites revealed an even more disturbing story. Chemical analysis showed unusually high levels of phosphates and heavy metals, commonly associated with decomposing organic matter. In particular, human remains, fragmented bones, including ribs, femurs, and jawbones, were unearthed just below the foundations of multiple moai scattered and burned. Many bore signs of blunt force trauma. Some had cut marks, and others appeared to have been subjected to intense heat, possibly through cremation or ritual fire. But the way they were arranged suggested something beyond typical burial. These weren't graves. They were disposals. There were no burial markers, no signs of reverence. If anything, the evidence pointed to violence. Death here was functional, purposeful, possibly sacrificial. One discovery in particular raised the stakes even further. Beneath the Moai known as Aututere, the team discovered a partially fused human jawbone melded directly into volcanic stone. The geological analysis indicated that the stone had been subjected to extreme heat after being placed, suggesting a high-temperature fire had been intentionally set at that specific location. The implication was gruesome. Either the jaw had been burned into the rock as part of a ritual, or it had been trapped there during some catastrophic event. In either case, it wasn't accidental. Someone wanted that jaw, and whoever it belonged to, locked in place forever. Perhaps even more unsettling were the acoustic anomalies recorded in these underground chambers. While mapping one of the deeper passageways beneath a statue cluster on the island's western ridge, researchers noticed something odd. A persistent low-frequency hum that grew louder the deeper they went. It wasn't mechanical, and it didn't match any known natural resonance from the surrounding geology. Audio engineers brought in to investigate described it as subsonic, but structured a frequency that could be felt more than heard. It vibrated in the chest, in the bones. One researcher described the sensation as standing in the presence of a sleeping engine or something alive. These same chambers also possessed a strange lack of natural echo, as if sound was being absorbed into the walls. Whether these were intentional design features or natural acoustic coincidences remains unknown, but either explanation points to knowledge and intent that goes far beyond what was once assumed of the island's early inhabitants. Adding to the mystery, ground-penetrating radar scans conducted in early 2024 revealed vast lava tubes and tunnel systems crisscrossing the island beneath known Moai locations. Some of these networks run directly beneath clusters of statues aligned in strange geometric patterns. Several of the tunnels appear to be modified, widened or supported with stone, and terminate in what look like artificial chambers, many still unexplored. If these Moai were merely ceremonial, why go to such lengths to bury them at top tunnel networks that had no apparent purpose above ground? One theory now gaining traction is that the statues were not memorials at all, but seals, heavy stone guardians placed deliberately to monitor or contain the structures below. Dr. Lena Morrow, one of the geologists on the recent expedition, described standing in one of these chambers as disorienting in a way I can't explain. She said, "It wasn't just silent. It felt like sound didn't belong there. You could hear your own heartbeat like it was echoing through your skull. And under the central shaft, there was this hum, this deep vibration that no one could trace. It didn't come from any single direction. It just was." What started as a curiosity about ancient stone statues has now become something more like an archaeological horror story. With each layer peeled back, it appears the Moai were not just relics of cultural pride or religious reverence. They were functional, built for a purpose aligned with something deeper, and possibly designed not to honor the dead, but to keep the living safe from what lay beneath their feet. But who were the people that built these colossal guardians? And what exactly were they trying to contain? Rapa Nui legends match modern evidence. Long before modern scientists arrived with drone scanners and soil probes, the Rapa Nui people already had an explanation for the Moai. And it wasn't peaceful. Moai, they are an important part of Easter Island and the Rapa Nui people. They are passed down for generations through oral tradition. The island's most enduring legends speak of a bitter struggle between two castes, the long ears and the short ears. And at first glance, it reads like simple mythology, the kind of symbolic tale you'd expect from any ancient culture. But recent archaeological evidence suggests it may have been much poorer than metaphor. According to the legend, the long ears were the ruling elite, taller, more powerful, and ruthless. They are said to have enslaved the short ears, forcing them to build the Moai and maintain the ceremonial platforms. Over time, resentment grew. Eventually, rebellion erupted. The short ears rose up, leading to a brutal civil war that ended with the near-total extermination of the long ears. The final confrontation supposedly took place near a trench filled with burning reeds into which the long ears were driven and killed. For centuries, this story was seen as symbolic, a cautionary tale about power and oppression. But when archaeologists began excavating sites around Pike Peninsula, where the rebellion was said to have occurred, they found something impossible to ignore. Buried beneath the hardened soil were layers of scorched earth, charcoal, and human remains burned in exactly the way the legend described. Some of the bones were arranged unnaturally, crammed together, as if the bodies had been dumped or pushed into fire. Radiocarbon dating placed the mass burning within the time frame that oral traditions had suggested. Even more compelling, DNA analysis of remains across different sites showed two distinct genetic populations, one physically taller on average with denser bone structures and signs of higher protein consumption, potentially the elite long ears. This was no allegory. The war really happened. And the Moai, according to some Rapa Nui elders, they weren't just symbols of status or ancestors. There have been no moai that are found in the dry bed or in what was previously a lake. They were believed to contain mana, a kind of spiritual force or energy that could both protect and destroy. The largest of them were thought to have been awakened, capable of walking, moving across the island through a combination of prayer ritual and song. This might sound like fantasy until modern researchers managed to replicate the so-called walking method by tying ropes around the statues and rhythmically rocking them forward, proving it was not only possible but practical. But perhaps the most spine-chilling detail from the legends is what the Moai were meant to watch. In some versions of the myth, the statues were deliberately placed to face inward, their backs to the sea. That has long puzzled archaeologists. Why turn your ancestors away from the vast ocean? The very source of Polynesian identity and sustenance. One version of the answer, preserved in whispers among the Rapa Nui's oral historians, is simple and terrifying. The Moai were watching something inside the island. Something that should never be allowed to escape. It's a claim that's easy to dismiss until you recall the recent ground scans and the vast unexplored tunnel systems directly beneath Moai clusters. Suddenly, those legends about watchers and containment don't seem so far-fetched, especially when combined with the fact that many of the Moai have been found standing above or near entry points to underground chambers. Some now proven to contain signs of ritual activity, fire damage, and even human remains. Further supporting the cultural-spiritual connection, some of the obsidian carvings found in the buried chambers resemble figures from Rapa Nui petroglyphs, elongated faces with hollow eyes, hands placed over the belly, and wide mouths frozen in either agony or awe. These symbols match closely with depictions of aku-aku ancestral spirits, said to guard sacred places and punish those who disturb the dead. Could the Moai themselves have been seen not just as monuments, but as vessels for these spirits, anchoring them to the island, keeping them quiet and contained? In light of these revelations, the line between myth and reality becomes blurry. What if the Rapa Nui weren't telling stories to explain their past, but were desperately preserving warnings for the future? What if the Moai weren't simply about who held power, but what had to be kept under control if the builders of the Moai were desperately trying to lock something away? How exactly did they do it? Advanced engineering beyond known technology. It's easy to underestimate the ancient world. We often imagine early islanders as tribal, primitive, and improvisational, surviving more than thriving. But Easter Island's Moai challenged that narrative at every turn, probably because they had to finish details, but they're just crazy. There's so many. These were not crude stone stacks hammered together with guesswork. They were precision-engineered monoliths, carved with skill, moved with intelligence, and positioned with intent. And when modern experts tried to reverse engineer how it was done, they didn't just find a method. They found a system. A system built by minds that knew far more than we've given them credit for. Each Moai is a masterpiece in its own right, weighing anywhere from 10 to 90 tons and standing up to 33 feet tall. These volcanic tough giants were carved in the Rano Raraku quarry, often directly into the rock face. But what stunned modern researchers wasn't just their size. It was their uniformity. Across hundreds of statues, the faces share precise proportions, symmetrical features, and consistent scale. That level of standardization implies measurement systems, templates, and repeatable techniques, not what you'd expect from a scattered tribal society without metal tools or written language. In 2022, a joint team from the University of Chile and MIT performed laser scans of several Moai statues and the surrounding quarry. What they found blew past all expectations. The chisel marks on the statues weren't random or irregular. They formed consistent patterns with micro-abrasions, suggesting the use of hardened stone tools that were applied with incredible control. Even more baffling, some of the marks resembled techniques seen in stonework from regions thousands of miles away, such as the keystone cuts of ancient Peru or the smooth scoop-like shaping found in Egyptian obelisks. How could such similar methods appear in cultures that never had contact? And then comes the biggest question of all. How did they move them? Early theories involved sledges, rollers, or even mass deforestation to create wooden transport systems. Theories that in hindsight seem both desperate and condescending. But in recent years, researchers have demonstrated that the statues could be walked upright using ropes. By tying ropes around the head and base of a statue, teams of about 15 to 20 people could rhythmically rock it side to side, pivoting it forward like a heavy refrigerator being tipped across a floor. This was no fluke. The experiment has been repeated successfully multiple times. Not only does this explain the legends of the Moai walking, but it also proves that the ancient Rapa Nui had developed logistics strategies that relied on teamwork, rhythm, and geometry, all without the wheelpack animals or cranes. More surprising still is the placement of the Moai across the island. They're not randomly scattered. They're aligned. Some face cardinal directions. Others are grouped in geometric patterns that only make sense from above. When plotted on a map, many fall along invisible lines that seem to trace the island's underlying lava tubes, fault lines, or magnetic anomalies. In a 2024 study, researchers discovered that certain MOI clusters sit directly above geomagnetic hotspots, places where the Earth's natural magnetic field behaves erratically. Why would an ancient society with no visible access to compasses or magnetometers care about these places? One possibility is that they didn't understand the science, but they felt the effect. The Rapa Nui people might have recognized these sites as spiritually charged or alive. Many ancient cultures attributed divine or supernatural power to places where compasses spin or where animals behave strangely. But what if it wasn't just a matter of spiritual intuition? What if the Moai were placed to harness or suppress something? An energy source, a force, or even a presence at these locations, at adding fuel to the mystery. Drone surveys conducted in 2023 revealed a pattern around some of the AU ceremonial platforms that support the Moai. Carefully arranged stone circles, trenches, and causeways that appear to channel water or sound. Some of these causeways form acoustic corridors where sound made at one end can be heard clearly at the other, even over distance. This suggests a working knowledge of resonance and acoustics, perhaps used in ritual, perhaps in function. But that's not the weirdest part. Some of the buried tunnels under the Moai amplify these sounds, turning faint footsteps into chest-thudding echoes. Could this have been by design? Was sound being used as a kind of technology to awaken something to warn others or to keep something asleep? What we're left with is a society that did far more than survive on a remote rock in the Pacific. They engineered, they calculated, they worked with scale geometry, acoustics, and weight in ways we're only just beginning to replicate. And all of it seems tied to the Moai. These weren't just statues. They were part of a system, an ancient machine made of stone spanning the island, and pointing to something we still don't fully understand. If the Rapa Nui had the knowledge to build and maintain such a system, why did they suddenly stop? And what happened when they did? Environmental collapse or human sacrifice? For decades, the fall of Easter Island has been held up as a cautionary tale, a warning about environmental destruction and the dangers of overconsumption. According to the popular story, the Rapa Nui people cut down every last tree to transport their precious moi, eventually triggering ecological collapse, famine, and societal ruin. On the surface, it's a neat modern morality play. But as new evidence comes to light, that explanation begins to crumble. And in its place emerges a far more disturbing possibility. The island didn't collapse because of carelessness. It collapsed because of ritual fear and possibly blood. The ecological theory first popularized in the early 2000s hinges on the idea that deforestation made agriculture unsustainable. The island's forests vanished, erosion increased, crops failed, and a desperate society turned on itself. But in the last 10 years, paleoenvironmental researchers have taken a closer look at the island's pollen records, sediment layers, and climate models, and the results don't match the story. Due to those changing conditions, and this morning we're giving you a closer look, tree pollen, for example, doesn't vanish gradually, as you'd expect with slow deforestation. Instead, it drops off abruptly, suggesting a sudden, possibly catastrophic change, not the slow grind of misuse. Likewise, radiocarbon dating of charcoal layers shows spikes of intense burning not across centuries, but over concentrated periods, especially near Moai clusters. So if the forests didn't disappear because of gradual overuse, what caused it? One controversial theory gaining traction is that much of the deforestation and many of the massive fires were ritualistic in nature. Trees may have been burned not just for land clearing or statue transport, but as part of sacrificial ceremonies or purifying rites. In fact, some of the burned sites contain not only charcoal and ash, but bones, obsidian tools, and carved religious icons, suggesting that fire was as much a spiritual tool as a practical one. Archaeologists have also uncovered evidence that suggests Rapa Nui society didn't simply collapse. It fractured violently. In multiple mass burial sites, bones show signs of trauma consistent with warfare or execution. Crushed skulls, embedded spear points, and even bones with clean, deliberate cuts as if dismembered. One dig at a ceremonial site near Auhangi revealed over 24 skeletons stacked together, all showing signs of burn trauma and ritual positioning. The remains were not buried with honor. They were dumped, their bones charred and broken. Even more chilling are the signs of cannibalism. A taboo subject often sensationalized, but now backed by hard evidence. Human bones with clear-cut marks and signs of cooking have been found in fire pits once thought to be domestic. In a 2023 report, bioarchaeologist Dr. Ka Tavares noted that some bones had been split in ways consistent with marrow extraction, a technique associated with survival cannibalism or ritualistic consumption. And in oral traditions, there are references often whispered to a time of eating shadows, when men fed on men not for hunger, but for power. Could it be that as the island's internal pressures mounted social unrest, fear of whatever the Moai were meant to guard, or even real geological upheaval, the people turned to increasingly desperate spiritual practices to appease their gods or to protect themselves from something worse? It's also worth noting that the end of Moai construction happened suddenly. One day, statues were being carved at full scale, some of them already over halfway completed. And then, everything stopped. Abandoned tools were found lying next to unfinished statues, as if the workers had dropped them mid-swing and never returned. If this was a slow environmental collapse, why would the entire statue-building enterprise grind to a halt all at once? What scared them enough to make them walk away from their most sacred sites by this point in the island's history? Records suggest that the once organized society had broken into factions, religious cults, warring tribes, and desperate priesthoods. And at the heart of it all was a profound, possibly growing fear. Was something escaping from beneath the earth, where the Moai, no longer enough to keep it sealed? Rapa Nui's dramatic societal unraveling, long blamed on ecological hubris, may instead have been driven by supernatural terror and sacrificial desperation. The fires weren't for farming. The bones weren't casualties of war. They were offerings, a deal made with something the people feared more than death itself. What exactly made them abandon the very statues they believed held back the darkness? If fear drove them to stop building a cult of fear. For centuries, the Moai rose, one by one. They were carved from volcanic rock, dragged or walked across the island and set upright on massive stone platforms. Some of the largest weigh over 80 tons. Their construction wasn't random. It was a national obsession, a sacred duty. And then it stopped abruptly. No slow decline, no tapering off, just silence. Archaeologists have always known about the incomplete Moai still resting in the Rano Raraku quarry. Some lie partially carved in the bedrock, others fully shaped but never transported. Tools were found next to them, chisels, stone picks, and rope fibers, all abandoned. For years, the assumption was practical. Maybe they ran out of resources, manpower, or political unity. But the more we learn, the less that explanation holds up. The quarry wasn't exhausted. There was still ample stone. The people hadn't vanished. They just stopped showing up. So what made them walk away from the work of generations? Recent excavations near unfinished Moai have revealed strange clues. At one site, red ochre symbols were painted across the face of a half-carved statue, symbols not seen in any completed Moai. Near another, researchers found a cache of smashed religious idols, deliberately broken and buried in a pit with animal bones and burned vegetation. This wasn't abandonment. It was a purge. Something had shifted not just economically, but spiritually. The builders weren't just giving up. They were rejecting the very act of building. Some of the most chilling evidence comes from later period rock art etched hastily into cave walls and cliffs across the island. Unlike the earlier petroglyphs, clean ceremonial often symbolic. These images are frantic, chaotic, wide-eyed figures with gaping mouths, spirals, and concentric circles radiating out from central voids. Human figures with missing limbs surrounded by jagged lines that some experts interpret as flames or waves of energy. One cave discovered in 2021 features a wall-length carving of a moai splitting in half with something it's hard to say. What rising out of it? To the Rapa Nui people, something had gone wrong. New discoveries of moai from the lake bed and under the present dry conditions. The moai had once protected them, connected them to their ancestors, channeled mana from the gods. But something changed. The energy shifted. The statues once revered were now feared. Whether it was a spiritual belief, a psychological breakdown, or something more tangible like an environmental event or geological anomaly, the people clearly came to see the moai not as salvation, but as threats. That fear left deep scars. In some areas, toppled statues lie face down, intentionally pushed over. It wasn't enemy action or colonial destruction. It predated European contact. In some oral traditions, it's said that certain moai had become angry, their mana corrupted. Elders warned not to go near them. One story speaks of a statue that spoke in the wind and caused illness to anyone who slept near it. These stories, once dismissed as superstition, now seem to echo the real psychological terror that gripped the island in its final years of monument building. And then, just as suddenly as it all began, the moai were no longer touched. The culture fractured. The Birdman cult, a far more brutal and secretive religion, rose from the ashes. Rituals moved underground into caves and volcanic tunnels. The moai were left to weather. Watchers once sacred were now abandoned. Their eyes, originally made of coral and painted pupils, were removed or destroyed, leaving them truly blind for the first time in centuries. The people didn't just stop building, they walked away from their gods. And the deeper you go into the ruins, the stronger the feeling becomes. The moai weren't simply abandoned because they failed. They were left behind because they succeeded, and in doing so revealed something too dangerous to face. The moai were seals, not symbols. All the evidence, the subterranean chambers, the sudden stop in construction, the burn pits, the rituals, the legends. It all points to one unnerving conclusion. The moai were never just monuments to gods or ancestors. They were never simply symbols of status unity or tradition. According to a growing faction of archaeologists, geologists, and cultural historians, the truth may be much darker. The moai were seals, not spiritual markers, not tribal art, but locks. This theory, once dismissed as fringe speculation, is now gaining serious academic traction. It suggests that the Rapa Nui people weren't building to glorify the dead. They were building to contain something alive, or at least something they believed had the power to affect the living. Not in the sky, not across the sea, but beneath their feet. It sounds like science fiction until you look at the data. In 2024, researchers using ground-penetrating radar and deep imaging sonar discovered a network of lava tubes and unnatural chambers directly beneath major moai sites. These weren't random formations. Many had been reinforced, carved, even marked with glyphs. One central cavern buried under a line of toppled statues near Anakaina, one of the most isolated inhabited islands on the planet, formed from volcanic eruptions in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, appeared to contain a central shaft lined with basalt slabs, each etched with symbols that don't match any known Rapa Nui language. The shaft descends into darkness and remains unexplored. Some believe these shafts weren't meant to contain energy, but to trap something ancient, something dangerous. If this theory is correct, the moai were strategically placed like plugs in a pressure valve. Immense stone guardians set atop sites where the boundary between surface and depth was weakest. The strange magnetic anomalies, the subsonic hums, the localized tremors recorded beneath these locations all begin to make more sense when viewed through this lens. The statues weren't idols. They were part of a containment system. And when the people of Rapa Nui sensed that the containment was failing, that the mana was no longer keeping the darkness in check, they panicked. They turned to fire blood sacrifice. When that didn't work, they fled the system entirely. They buried it in silence, hoping no one would dig too deep. The implications of this theory are enormous. It reframes the entire story of Easter Island, from a tale of ecological caution to something far more primal, a survival story, a last stand. The island wasn't a paradise ruined by its people. It was a battleground, and the Moai were its front line. One researcher, speaking anonymously, put it like this: "The deeper we dig, the more it looks like the Moai were suppressing a threat. Not just symbolically, but literally. Something beneath the island is wrong. It doesn't match natural models." We found geological evidence of heat signatures, vibration patterns, even pressure pulses that suggest something is still active below. And the scariest part, some of the statues have fallen. They weren't designed to tip over. Once toppled, many break at the neck, structurally compromised and rendered useless. If they really were part of a containment system, what happens when too many fail? What happens when we disturb what they were built to hold down? The island's silence may not be peaceful. It may be holding its breath. What's the truth and what's not? Leave your comments in the section below and subscribe to this channel for future uploads.